Water. Earth. Fire. Air. Long ago, the four nations lived together in harmony. Then, everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Only the Avatar, master of all four elements, could stop them. But when the world needed him most, he vanished. 100 years passed and my brother and I discovered the new Avatar, an airbender named Aang. And although his airbending skills are great, he has a lot to learn before he's ready to save anyone. But I believe Aang can save the world.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Artenders. This is Danny Lavelle, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Mac Welch.
Howdy.
We do this podcast in order to learn, observe, and grow as artists, each and every week. We choose something to view, and we watch it, discuss, and enjoy it, of course. And so for this week, per Mac's suggestion, we watched the first season, or book, as they call it, of the TV show Avatar: The Last Airbender. In this first season, it follows the protagonist Aang, who is the titular last airbender and the Avatar, meaning he is the master of 4 different elements. But he hasn't learned the rest of those elements. He only knows air, so he travels with his new friends Katara and Sokka throughout this season in order to go about and learn water as his next element. And throughout this, he is also being pursued by this man named Zuko and his uncle, who is the prince. Zuko is the prince of the Fire Nation, who is this sort of evil empire now. And Aang's duty is to learn these elements as soon as possible in order to stop the conquest of the Fire Nation and bring harmony between the 4 nations of water, earth, fire, and air. And so, with that big summary...
What an excellent summary. What a good summary.
I tried.
Very concise.
Not a funny summary, but like this, the bare bones sort of like, this is kind of what happens here.
Money. That was money.
So, this show premiered in 2005, if I'm not mistaken. And
Weird.
I want to ask you, Mac, how do you feel this show holds up compared to 2005 and 2020 and where you are in your life, too?
Really stands up, that's for sure. In a much different way. I didn't realize that it was one of those shows that played and pandered to parents as well as kids, but in just much different ways. Because there are plenty of shows just like that, but this one does an especially good job of it because it talks so much about like government and culture and power and whatnot. So what's so interesting, I think, is that the dialogue and the concepts and the world panders to kids, while the actions and the roles pander a little more to the adults. So being more on the adult side now, I'd say it holds up, but just in a much different way, than I remember it being. Was there anything specifically different that you noticed? Because you didn't really watch it the first time around, but was there anything that you were shocked by that you found specifically interesting this time around?
Yeah, so as you said, I didn't really watch much of the show when I was younger. I only have seen a few episodes of it, so I can't really speak to the series as a whole. And this is actually my first time starting really the series, as a series and not just something that would just be on TV that I would put on. I found it to be enjoyable, and I was also surprised by the more adult themes. And one point that I kind of want to hold on to was the theme of culture, which is such, I think, one of the biggest themes throughout this show. The idea of, in order to succeed, I guess, as a nation, and going about but in order to do so, destroying the culture of other places, of other people. What's the cost of that? And that's a question that's consistently asked throughout the show, and that's a really big question too. At the end of the season, when we're looking at when the trio arrive at the Northern Air Temple, is a very good example. That this old home that Aang used to visit, or at least was part of his people, was now transformed into this sort of steampunk sort of temple. Like it's really jarring for him, and so the question multiple times throughout the episode is asked, like, you use this and this is your home now, but you destroyed what made this place. And then it goes further into detail when Admiral Zhao, now at the very end of the season, is attacking the Water Tribe in the North Pole, and sets out to kill the moon spirit. So, like, what's the cost of, like, sacrificing that culture, right? Of sacrificing a huge identity in a people in order to bring oneself to higher heights. And so that's a question that I enjoyed that the show consistently asked, and it seemed to be that the consistent answer was, like, there wasn't like a black and white answer, you know? There was like a give and take, you know, if that makes sense.
Well, one thing that's really interesting that the show does, it does a very interesting job of world building. The world that it decides to be is a really interesting one, a very intriguing one, for a lot of different reasons. But one thing that it does is that instead of just making up whole other things, and instead of making up an entirely unknown world, like Lord of the Rings does, where 100% fictional, it's only like 50% fictional, this world. It draws so much influence and really does try to ground itself in things that are known, I suppose, out of a sort of respect to the influences that it has. But one thing that it does in doing so, it does not try to draw inspiration from any one specific culture. It uses the Japanese language several times. It uses the Mandarin language several times. The fighting styles cover so many different cultures and different peoples over history. What do you think about that? What do you think about its grouping of all of these things together? Its influences that it's taken from the world that we know, and in its world building that it tries to do.
I'm gonna want to discuss the sort of 50% sort of like actual nonfiction, but we'll get there. I will say though that I enjoy this show being a very big amalgamation of like East Asian, South Asian, Inuit culture, and making a very much so believable world out of that the world itself stands on its own. And so when each new episode starts, I'm always really curious as to like, okay, how are they now broadening this world? And I think Lord of the Rings is a different but good example in the sense of world building, where we have Tolkien construct such an interesting structure in this world building, that the nuances and the interactions between people and culture, and how they celebrate culture in and of themselves. I don't know, like I'm saying a whole lot of nothing right now, but all of it to say that this show is cool, and it's a nice exercise of like creativity at the very least, while still being true and taking inspiration from different groups of people, and I think honoring them in a beautiful way. So, but I want to touch on, why do you think this show is necessarily like 50% nonfiction? That was, why is that?
Because I think that it's the actual world that they live in is one that's pretty historically rooted. There's a lot of things that it doesn't ever attempt to sell you something that's entirely different until you get into the sequel series with Legend of Korra. That's its own thing. The way that they even openly accept that at some points in the series that they are that they are tied to Buddhist culture, and they use the Buddhist like monks as a very prevalent part of the series. So even though the result is different, the result is these kids being able to bend elements. These results being able to, like, there's like a different geographical setup, or like there's spirits that they live amongst, or whatever.
A lot of these motifs that are drawn from real world elements.
Even though the results are a fictional thing, the ground is non-fictional.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And I think that actually kind of goes into my sizzle serve.
Oh, okay. So,
Right.
would you like to explain this new bit that we're trying?
So sizzle serve is a new bit that we're trying on the show that is basically we both take turns giving a take that we think is so ridiculously hot, sizzling off the press that it is going to knock the other person's socks off, and hopefully spark an interesting debate.
But it's also a take that we believe in. Like, we're not just saying a take to say a take.
No. Right.
We have to back up.
So this
what
is
we're
something
saying.
that I actually believe about this show.
Yes.
And you know that I'm a big prefacer, so I'm going to preface this.
Okay.
Although I don't think the world itself is necessarily the best world that I have seen from a television series, I think that this television series does a better job of world building and of setting up the world and introducing you to the world than any other television series that I have ever seen in my life.
All right. So like that makes me I want to disagree. I can't think of a more interesting example, or like are you so
Right.
you're saying that this show does a better job at world building, or you yourself are most interested in the building of this world? Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah. So I like the actual world itself. Whenever you look at the world that they have built, do I think it is the best? Not necessarily. Do I think that there's a couple holes there? A little bit, yeah. But we'll get to that once we cover the book 2 and book 3 and Legend of Korra and everything. But I think that the way that it introduces you to things, the way that every single episode you learn something new and interesting and almost like world-shattering about the world that like opens you up to a whole different thing, the way that the characters interact with the world and how you end up learning about the world around you. The series, especially in book 1, but the whole time, it never stops teaching you about the world that you are living in, which I think is the strong point of the show and the most interesting hook of the show.
I think that's also a big issue with the show. And yes, I see you smiling.
Interesting. Well, I like it.
Because I think a big issue with this show is that the show very much so knows what it is, right? It knows that it's a kid show, but it knows also that it's dealing with like crazy oppression and politics.
Right.
And how it blends together is a very interesting and beautiful way. But this show is only about 23 minutes long each episode. This show could not possibly have enough time to really take care of each individual episode's unique characters and unique situations. I think a very good example is the episode The Great Divide. Ooh, that I can't even remember the exact names of the two different tribes that it's dealing with. I'm going to look into it right now. But that episode doesn't give enough time to those individual parties. It is the Ganjin and the Zhang. Of course, with 23 minutes, when you're trying to focus on the development of at least Aang and or Katara and or Sokka, and then you're also trying to introduce these new elements in this world and what's going on, and kind of like how does this have to do with the ongoing turmoil in the world? Plus, then we have these two individual tribes who are dealing with each other, who have a long history with the individual characters in there who don't get a lot of development, which is kind of an issue here and there. And then also the tour guide, like there's not enough time for each episode for this show to really plant its feet in a character or in a people, in a situation. And I don't even think that's the only situation.
Mm-hmm. You think that they've maybe bit off more than they can chew?
I think so. Yeah. Do I blame that on the showrunners? No, because they probably had, if they wanted this show to get off the ground, then they probably had know the situation, but making it into a very digestible 23 minutes, put on commercials, make it 30. That's probably the situation that I think happened, but that doesn't mean the show is better for it, you know. Mind you, then there's a really fine line to that. And the big thing that I think about is a lot of Game of Thrones episodes, when I think about them, are very interpolitically connected and talks a lot about politics. And so is politics interesting? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And I felt that at the beginning of the show, the politics weren't that interesting, but kind of like halfway through, when like things started happening to like each individual group and how they were all interconnected, then I thought the show was really interesting. But that show was allowed to do that and had the ability to do that for the most part until the very end, because it was split up into these 45-minute blocks. And so having double that time is such a big aid when you are trying to develop not only your characters and make the audience care about them, but also care about the world and the situation that they're living in. So yeah,
I'd like to talk about dive a little bit deeper with that specific topic and the structural repercussions that it has on the way that they tell the story. Whenever we come back. So first, we're gonna take a quick little listen to our sponsor. Yeah,
you got it.
All right. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Now, just let me explain. First of all, it's free. Second of all, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a whole bunch more. And third, now this is really important, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hear me when I say no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. All right, and we are back. We are back to the discussion on Avatar: The Last Airbender, Book 1. Now, what we were talking about before we left was the movement of information, correct? Your relationship with character arc, how you're given information on characters, and how you think that might hinder the show because it's really short episodes, very, very short episodes, and they're palatable, but they're short, so you don't get hooked that hard. And you think they might have bit off more than they can chew. Now, I think that is a product of... Let me say it like this. Right. They had a choice very early on as to whether they were going to be an episodic series where there's a story for each episode, and very slowly you get the journey, almost like a sitcom. Or they could do a series-long or season-long arc, because whenever you have like a 23-minute show like this on Nickelodeon with that slot, you either have to go episodic or you have to go like full balls to the wall commitment to one story for an entire season or entire series. They did both. They decided to do both. They were like, we're going to have a very subtle but always present and always focused larger arc, and how we get to that thing is explored in each episode's full story.
Right.
And in doing so,
they did.
You split up the episodes into the parts of the episode where I learned stuff about the main characters, and the parts of the episode where I learned stuff about the not main characters and what we have to do to help them. And that does take away quite a bit of time to experience things with other with the main characters. But I will say, I'd be interested to come back after we watch the full series and talk about what loose ends there were with the main characters, because I don't think there are really any, and I think they do a kind of strange job of there's certain information that they just want to simplify because they're like, no one really gives a shit about that. So like for instance, like a perfect way of making Fire Lord Ozai as scary as possible is just like, we're just never going to give you information about him. We're only going to learn about him through Zuko and
through Iroh
and through characters later on in the series.
Yeah.
But that's going to be it. And they do that with a lot of characters, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there are any loose ends.
Oh, well,
Oh yeah, go ahead.
the loose ends that I think about, right, are characters that have their own like little episode that aren't fully explored, and it seems like we're not going to see them again. I think Haru is a good example. And the other Earth Tribe
Oh wow,
villagers in, I can't even remember the episode name, but it was like, oh shoot, Imprisoned. It was the episode titled Imprisoned. It was the 6th episode and just barely on it. And that seemed like the sort of character where we're not going to see again. But it was interesting when he was on screen how at least he affected Katara as a character. But and so like that was more so like an episode for Katara, right? But that doesn't make me disinterested in the development of his character. I think another even better example is the character of Jet, where Jet's a really interesting character. That he's kind of like the Fire Nation ideology, where everything is a means to an end. That he's like doing the right thing, but in order to get to the right thing, he knows that he has to do wrong things, and that's just that. I mean, as a sort of role that a character plays, that is always super interesting because there's a lot of nuance in there, and is not as clear cut as somebody, vast majority of the time, like Aang and like Katara, that are just like pure people, except for singular moments throughout the season.
So if we are never to return to those characters, why did we spend like a whole half an episode to learn about them?
And so, I mean, I feel that, and so, like, yes, why do we spend, this whole half an episode getting to know them, and at the same time, like, I know why we did. Only getting to know them was a means to an end of getting to know Aang, Katara, Sokka, sometimes Zuko.
Yeah.
So, like, I understand, but that doesn't, like, yeah, I understand that the strategy, I guess, behind that, and the what they were trying to go for behind that, but that doesn't necessarily make the show better because we still lose out on these potentially very interesting characters.
What was your sizzle serve?
Well, my sizzle serve, I'll just go very briefly into it. I think this show would be better and more narratively interesting if we just followed Zuko the whole time.
Oh, I like that take. I like that take a whole lot.
Because I understand what this show is trying to serve, right? As we said, this show was on Nickelodeon. It's at the end of the day, at the very end of the day, even though an adult can watch this show is designed to also appeal to children. So it's difficult to have this show follow the sort of redemption arc. And it's very clear that he's going to have a redemption arc that Zuko is experiencing, and this sort of...
Why is it clear?
Because, of course, like, when you take a cookie cutter of an anti-hero, Zuko is, like, the perfect anti-hero.
Zuko is it.
He
You're
fits all of, like, the boxes. Like, if anti-hero was as trope of it, like, as can be, Zuko would be it. I think Zuko's progression as a character is infinitely more interesting than Aang, than Katara, and Sokka's combined. And I know that, like I said, how the show is designed, that we ought to follow those 3 characters. This show as a whole, I think, would be better if we followed Zuko because of Zuko's backstory, because of what Zuko has to deal with then, and what he has to deal with currently, and you can already tell the growth of his character, right? The sort of, like, endgame, right? So Aang's endgame is learning all the elements so he can stop the Fire Nation and bring peace and harmony throughout the world. Cool. Whatever. That's neat. What makes Zuko so interesting, and Iroh...
Cool, whatever.
Iroh talks a lot about this. I cannot remember which episode exactly. I think not sure. But when Iroh is talking to crew members of the ship that they're on, and so Iroh knows that even if Zuko finds Aang, like he retrieves the avatar and brings it to his father to get respect and honor back, because Zuko was banished for like speaking up, even though he was right. Even if Zuko gets the avatar, that doesn't mean like he wins, right?
And is that how you would separate seasons?
I think say what?
Is that how you would separate seasons if Zuko was the protagonist? It's like he gets the thing he thinks he needs, and that's not enough, and so the next season is getting another thing that he thinks he needs. That's not enough.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think that's infinitely more interesting growth of a character. I always think the characters that have to really deal with things on a deep personal level are so much more interesting than characters. Well, I will say that's a little bit unfair, considering that Katara and Sokka's mother was killed and that Aang was trapped in this bubble for 100 years and his entire world has changed. So that's a little bit unfair. But I think the deep contrast between what Zuko is trying to be and wants to be and who he actually is would make for a much more interesting show, and a show that would be much more, I think, worth the investment. I don't think the show is bad. I still find the show to be enjoyable. And the show would be, I would say, grittier at the very least if it just followed Zuko. But I think the show, at the end of the day, would be better.
I would agree if it weren't for the episode style. If the episodes were longer, I'd be 100% down, and I would totally agree that it should be Zuko that we're centered around. But if we're talking about the run into a situation, we all have to solve it together and learn something about ourselves along the way type of structure, and the 23 minutes, I think that you kind of have to go with a more simple and understandable protagonist like Aang.
Yeah, and I like I said, I understand the situation that the show is in. That doesn't mean the show could be better.
Yeah.
But that's my sizzle. That's my serve.
So does that lead into your gold medal?
Yes, in some ways, yes. So another bit that we're trying this week is gold medal, and each of us have a gold medal, and we want to give it to a character or maybe a person involved with the show that we feel deserves this gold medal. And I think mine is going to be a little bit of an interesting pick, because I don't think this character got enough love throughout the season, and it seems like at the end of the season we're not going to see this character again. I am going to give my gold medal to oh my god, I almost butchered his name. I'm going to give my gold medal to Zhao.
Interesting. Oh, that's a fucking sizzle serve. Zhao? Okay.
To Zhao.
Big Y.
Aside
Big
from
Y.
him having the best vocal performance,
Okay.
like as an actor, I think he was played by Jason Isaacs. I want to be so right.
Don't we all?
But what makes Zhao really interesting is that we get a little bit of backstory on Zhao.
Very little, yeah.
Very little, but enough to kind of make us like understand like who he is as a person, how he thinks, and how he views the world, his worldview. And what makes Zhao the most interesting is how he serves as a character to both Zuko and Iroh. And so when we get the characters with a little bit more Zhao progression, I'm always interested in that. Like, for example, Zhang being Zhao's old master that we find out in the episode The Deserter says a lot about Zhao as a person. And I think Zhao is a terrific antagonist where we don't feel bad for Zhao at all. We don't like Zhao at all. I don't like Zhao at all, and it's very clear you're not meant to. But I like him in the sense of a character and what he serves to the other characters, and primarily what he does and how he pushes Zuko. I think if I had a silver medal, I would give it to Iroh, but I feel like that's obvious because Iroh is just the greatest wise old men, and I love wise old men.
Totally agree.
But I think Zhao was underappreciated and underutilized. And I think everybody knew he was a great character, but they didn't use him enough, I don't think.
Mm-hmm.
Who was your gold medal?
Well, Zhao is still just so interesting, and
because we get enough of Zhao for me to just really want more of Zhao.
Yeah, I could see why that would make you want to give him the gold medal, and also because they're very good about Easter eggs with Zhao. They're very good about, like, here's a tiny piece of information that if you really think about it hard enough, you'll learn a lot about Zhao.
Yeah.
Which honestly kind of leads into my gold medal as well, kind of for a similar reason. Funny enough, I think my gold medal for the first season goes to Appa, which is the flying bison that Aang flies around on with his friends. That purely because, kind of in a weirdly similar way, you learn very little about him. You don't really know anything about him. One second, you don't know anything about him. He can't fucking talk. Like, there's very little to say about him, but for some reason, he still has a clear personality, a very clear place in the show, contributes to the plot very consistently, is constantly a savior for them.
Contributes to the plot.
Good.
I want to tackle that one.
Oh, yeah? You think so? Okay.
Yeah. Listen, I think Appa is a vehicle in the literal and figurative sense. And I don't think anything more than that. What do you mean contributes to the plot?
How many times, how many fights can you think of that happened where they would have been okay without Appa?
They would have just... He
saved the day like over half the time.
But that doesn't necessarily make him a good character. He's just a MacGuffin then.
Oh, like something that you would want to buy into, but like you're just never going to get any more information on?
Yeah, well, I mean, at least, so like in this first season, right? Like, we don't get a lot of information on Appa. We have no idea how Aang and Appa met. We just know that Aang has Appa. I'm not sure. It seems like we find out in the Winter Solstice episodes that, like, each avatar has their own, like, spirit animal that, like, sort of guides them. That Roku had a dragon, and so Aang has a flying bison. Which is just funny enough on its own. I will admit that is really funny. He just has a flying bison.
Yeah.
But we don't know anything about Appa. So I have a hard time being like, Appa's really important to the plot, because, like, Appa is just a means so that Aang, starting at the South Pole, can get to the North Pole quickly and efficiently and within a reasonable amount of time.
Do you not think that there's any emotional support, or that Appa is some sort of emotional support system for Aang?
I think in some ways, but even if I say yes, I don't think the show itself actually supports that. I think it's possible, but I don't think we see enough of Appa being that system for Aang that I don't, like I said, I don't see Appa being anything more than a vehicle.
There's also, though, a very interesting thing that it does, where it does such a good job of humanizing and characterizing Appa, and there are several times where, like, without words, simply, like, by, like, the most simple animation and actions, Appa becomes a person.
Are you invested in Appa as a character?
Yeah.
Okay.
I am. You're like, then you need help.
You do. I think Appa's cool. Appa's fun. Appa's relatively interesting. I mean, just look at him. He has 6 legs.
But he's not the gold medal.
But as a character? Yeah, as a character? I don't think he really serves the story. But that's what I think. So, briefly, before we get into what we're going to view for next week as we start to wrap up, I want to briefly touch on, what is your favorite episode in this first season?
For me, it is going to have to be the final episodes of this of this season, The Siege of the North.
The two-parter, The Siege of the
Yeah,
North?
both parts together. Because they're listed as the same episode, so I'm going to classify them as the same episode.
Yeah. But they released on the same day.
Yeah. Purely because this is the very first time that we as an audience is really given any sort of sense of change that happens in Aang, specifically as a protagonist, that we are able to see his power at all, like being able to see him become the monster, is extremely impactful. I mean, so much character shit happens between all the protagonists. I think, like you said, it's tough to really buy into any one specific episode because there's really like just not many episodes that dive deep into the main characters. It's very little about the main characters and so much about the random people we meet on the way, that the last episode is really the only time that happens for us. What do you think
Of the last couple episodes?
No. Of what's your favorite episode?
Okay. I found my favorite episode to be the Blue Spirit episode, the 13th episode.
Yeah.
The reason...
Well, of course, because of your sizzle serve.
Yeah, because I think Zuko was so interesting. But what makes this my favorite episode is that it's an episode about Zuko. Zuko says no more than 10 words.
True.
That Zuko's actions say so much about him. So to briefly just remind that Zuko saves Aang from a Fire Nation fortress that Zhao is controlling. But Zuko does this by putting on a blue mask, and he has two swords. He never uses firebending to go and save Aang, but he saves Aang in order to get Aang, in order for him to receive the honor from his father that he lost. And he says no more than 10 words. And so once Aang discovers that it's Zuko, he saves Zuko and says to Zuko, do you think like 100 years ago, like if we knew each other or if we were under better circumstances, like we would be friends? And that's just like, and
you remember then, that shit.
Of course.
Remember it.
Of course. Of course. And then when he gets back on the ship, Zuko, when he gets back on the ship, then you just get this shot of him lying down in bed and like thinking about it, and just that one shot, like you don't need words for that shot because like you can already tell the change is bubbling beneath him, and even though like he hasn't experienced that change yet, the seed has been planted.
The seed has been planted. So you like it because it's the beginning of Zuko's journey.
Zuko's journey, and it's very clear. Zuko's journey of turning stuff around. Yeah.
You Zuko stan. You're so funny.
I'm a Zuko stan. And not because like yes, go ahead.
As we were going into watching the series recently, like the full series all the way through, I turned to Emma and I was like, you would not believe who has the most stan accounts out of every character in the show. And she guessed every fucking character before Zuko. And I was like,
oh, that's absurd.
You wouldn't believe it, Emma, but by a landslide, there are more Zuko stan accounts than any other character in the series by a far and wide margin.
Because Zuko has the biggest potential of a growth of a character in this show.
Yeah.
It's just potential. And when you even like, let's say like, I don't think they do. I doubt that they do, judging by what you just said. But let's just say that this show doesn't do his arc justice, right?
Yeah.
At the end of the day, though, right now his arc still has the biggest potential for something crazy and something very interesting to happen.
True. And also one thing that this show does so well, and this is going to be something that we're going to have to talk about whenever it comes to Legend of Korra, is that there's they handle questions really well. They handle unknowns and they handle secrets really well. Because whenever you don't know something and it becomes obvious that you don't know something, it tells you, don't worry, you're not supposed to know that yet. And then all the characters get together and solve that problem as soon as possible. So whenever you have an unknown, you address it immediately. Whereas with Legend of Korra, and a lot of other problems with a lot of other series, is that you get an unknown, you get a secret, you get a question, and then you're asked to just kind of hold on to that in the back of your head for a really long time before it's addressed again. And it's very good about setting things up and addressing them, and then setting them up and then addressing them, you know?
So, my final thoughts on this show.
Yeah.
I do recommend this show. I think it's an easy, bingeable watch. I think it's a good time. It's hard for me to ignore the potential of what this show has and what this show could be, and maybe it does reach that potential later on. But in terms of just looking at the first season, it's a fun watch. And at some points too, you'll adjust yourself in your chair and like, oh, this is getting really interesting. And I think this show displays a lot of growth, and it goes to show how much growth further the show can display. Mac.
I think that speaking to the other side of the audience that has already seen this show before, that maybe hasn't seen it again recently, it's not a matter of you rewatch it and you're like, oh, I just never saw this stuff before, like, oh, like cool things you catch the second time. It is an entirely different show, 100% different show this time around as you're watching it at an older age, once you've learned a little more about the world and about politics and about how things function. It becomes so clear that these writers were well aware of what they were doing as they were writing it, and it's very clever. So I highly recommend rewatching it for those that would be.
And so now for next week, I was thinking of also doing something nostalgic, but nostalgic in a different way. Something that I still haven't seen, but it's nostalgic because it has to do with my home and where I come from. And so the movie that we're going to watch for next week is titled The Florida Project.
And it's a movie?
That is a movie. It is a 2017 film directed by Sean Baker, starring Willem Dafoe. I don't know much about it, but I remember seeing a trailer years ago, and like two kids in the movie run past this ice cream place called Twisty Treat, and I love Twisty Treat. They're all over Florida, and so being from Orlando, and I think it takes place in Orlando as well. No idea if it's good, but
we'll find out.
I've always wanted to see it, and yeah, nostalgic in a different way. It's it's nostalgic once again for childhood and home, and I think in many ways like Avatar was to you, but also in a different way in terms of nostalgia. But I wanted to explore that. Nevertheless, here we are, and here we are done. Mac, thank you again, and thank you folks for listening.
Thank you.